The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service upon the United States against the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, territory of Hawaii, just before 8 a.m. local time, on Sunday, December 7, 1941. On Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attacked the neutral United States on ongoing World War II, at Naval Station Pearl Harbor near Honolulu, Hawaii, killing 2,403 Americans and injuring 1,178 others. The attack sank 4 U.S. Navy battleships and damaged 4 others. It also damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 1 mine layer. Aircraft losses were 188 destroyed and 159 damaged. Canada declared war on Japan within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the first Western nation to do so. The neutral United States country at the time formally entered into World War II the next day. On December 8, the United States declared war on Japan and entered World War II on the side of the Allies. In a speech to Congress, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the bombing of Pearl Harbor a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese military leadership referred to the attack as the Hawaii Operation, and Operation AI, and as Operation Z, during its planning. Japan intended the attack as a preventive action. Its aim was to prevent the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in Southeast Asia against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and those of the United States. Over the course of 7 hours there were coordinated Japanese attacks on the US-held Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, and on the British Empire, in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The attack commenced at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, 6:18 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time Zone. The base was attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft, including fighters, level, and dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, in 2 waves, launched from 6 aircraft carriers. Of the 8 U.S. Navy battleships present, all were damaged, with 4 sunk. All but USS Arizona were later raised, and 6 were returned to service and went on to fight in the war. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. More than 180 U.S. aircraft were destroyed. 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 others were wounded. Japanese losses were light: 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, and 64 servicemen killed. Kazuo Sakamaki, the commanding officer of one of the submarines, was captured. Japan announced declarations of war on the United States and the British Empire later that day, December 8, in Tokyo, but the declarations were not delivered until the following day. The British government declared war on Japan immediately, after learning that their territory had also been attacked, while the following day, December 8, the United States Congress declared war on Japan. On December 11, though they had no formal obligation to do so under the tripartite pact with Japan, Germany and Italy each declared war on the US, which responded with a declaration of war against Germany and Italy. There were numerous historical precedents for the unannounced military action by Japan, but the lack of any formal warning, required by Part 3 of the Hague Convention of 1907, particularly while peace negotiations were still apparently ongoing, led President Franklin D. Roosevelt to proclaim December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Because the attack happened without a declaration of war and without explicit warning, the attack on Pearl Harbor was later judged in the Tokyo trials to be a war crime. In mid-1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii. He also ordered a military buildup in the Philippines, taking both actions in the hope of discouraging Japanese aggression in the Far East. Because the Japanese High Command was, mistakenly, certain any attack on the United Kingdom's Southeast Asian colonies, including Singapore, would bring the U.S. into the war, a devastating preventive strike appeared to be the only way to prevent American naval interference. An invasion of the Philippines was also considered necessary by Japanese war planners. The U.S. War Plan Orange had envisioned defending the Philippines with an elite force of 40,000 men. This option was never implemented due to opposition from Douglas MacArthur, who felt he would need a force 10 times that size. By 1941, U.S. planners expected to abandon the Philippines at the outbreak of war. Late that year, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, was given orders to that effect. The U.S. finally ceased oil exports to Japan in July 1941, following the seizure of French Indochina after the fall of France, in part because of new American restrictions on domestic oil consumption. Japan proceeded with plans to take the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. On August 17, Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take opposing steps if neighboring countries were attacked. The Japanese were faced with a dilemma. Either withdraw from China and lose face or seize new sources of raw materials in the resource-rich European colonies of Southeast Asia. Japan and the U.S. engaged in negotiations during 1941, attempting to improve relations. In the course of these negotiations, Japan offered to withdraw from most of China and Indochina, after making peace with the nationalist government. It also proposed to adopt an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact, and to refrain from trade discrimination, provided all other nations reciprocated. Washington rejected these proposals. Japanese Prime Minister Konoye then offered to meet with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt insisted on reaching an agreement before any meeting. The U.S. ambassador to Japan repeatedly urged Roosevelt to accept the meeting, warning that it was the only way to preserve the conciliatory Konoye government and peace in the Pacific. However, his recommendation was not acted upon. The Konoye government collapsed the following month when the Japanese military rejected a withdrawal of all troops from China. Japan's final proposal, delivered on November 20, offered to withdraw from southern Indochina, and to refrain from attacks in Southeast Asia, so long as the United States, United Kingdom, and Netherlands supplied 1 million U.S. gallons or 3.8 million liters of aviation fuel, lifted their sanctions against Japan, and ceased aid to China. The American counter-proposal of November 26, November 27 in Japan, the Hull Note, required Japan completely evacuate China without conditions, and conclude non-aggression pacts with Pacific powers. On November 26, in Japan, the day before the note's delivery, the Japanese task force left port for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese intended the attack as a preventive action to keep the United States Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in Southeast Asia, against overseas territories of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States. Over the course of 7 hours there were coordinated Japanese attacks on the US-held Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, and on the British Empire in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Additionally, from the Japanese viewpoint, it was seen as a preemptive strike before the oil gauge ran empty. Preliminary planning for an attack on Pearl Harbor to protect the move into the southern resource area, the Japanese term for the Dutch East Indies, and Southeast Asia generally, had begun very early in 1941, under the auspices of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then commanding Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto won assent to formal planning and training for an attack from the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff only after much contention with naval headquarters, including a threat to resign his command. Full-scale planning was underway by early spring 1941, primarily by Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, with assistance from Captain Minoru Genda, and Yamamoto's Deputy Chief of Staff, Captain Kameto Kirishima. The planners studied the 1940 British air attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto intensively. Over the next several months, pilots were trained, equipment was adapted, and intelligence was collected. Despite these preparations, Emperor Hirohito did not approve the attack plan until November 5, after the third of 4 imperial conferences called to consider the matter. Final authorization was not given by the emperor until December 1, after a majority of Japanese leaders advised him that Hull Note would destroy the fruits of the China incident, endanger Manchukuo, and undermine Japanese control of Korea. By late 1941, many observers believed that hostilities between the US and Japan were imminent. A Gallup poll just before the attack on Pearl Harbor found that 52% of Americans expected war with Japan, 27% did not, and 21% had no opinion. While U.S. Pacific bases and facilities had been placed on alert on many occasions, U.S. officials doubted Pearl Harbor would be the first target. Instead, they expected the Philippines would be attacked first. This presumption was due to the threat that the air bases throughout the country and the naval base at Manila posed to sea lanes, as well as to the shipment of supplies to Japan from territory to the south. They also incorrectly believed that Japan was not capable of mounting more than one major naval operation at a time. The Japanese attack had several major aims. First, it intended to destroy important American fleet units, thereby preventing the Pacific Fleet from interfering with the Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, and enabling Japan to conquer Southeast Asia without interference. Second, It was hoped to buy time for Japan to consolidate its position and increase its naval strength before shipbuilding authorized by the 1940 Vincent Walsh Act erased any chance of victory. Third, to deliver a blow to America's ability to mobilize its forces in the Pacific, battleships were chosen as the main targets, since they were the prestige ships of any navy at the time. Finally, it was hoped that the attack would undermine American morale such that the U.S. government would drop its demands contrary to Japanese interests, and would seek a compromise peace with Japan. Striking the Pacific Fleet, at anchor in Pearl Harbor, carried two distinct disadvantages. The targeted ships would be in very shallow water, so it would be relatively easy to salvage and possibly repair them, and most of the crews would survive the attack since many would be on shore leave or would be rescued from the harbor. A further important disadvantage was the absence from Pearl Harbor of all three of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Imperial Japan Navy Top Command was attached to Admiral Mahan's decisive battle doctrine, especially that of destroying the maximum number of battleships. Despite these concerns, Yamamoto decided to press ahead. Japanese confidence in their ability to win a short war also meant other targets in the harbor, especially the Navy Yard, oil tank farms, and submarine base, were ignored since by their thinking the war would be over before the influence of these facilities would be felt. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese task force, the striking force of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, departed Hitokapu Bay, on Kasaka, now Itarup, Island, in the Kuril Islands, en route to a position northwest of Hawaii, intending to launch its 408 aircraft to attack Pearl Harbor, 360 for the 2 attack waves, and 48 on Defensive Combat Air Patrol or CAP, including 9 fighters from the first wave. The first wave was to be the primary attack, while the second wave was to attack carriers as its first objective, and cruisers as its second, with battleships as the third target. The first wave carried most of the weapons to attack capital ships, mainly specially adapted Type 91 aerial torpedoes, which were designed with an anti-roll mechanism, and a rudder extension that let them operate in shallow water. The air crews were ordered to select the highest value targets, battleships and aircraft carriers, or, if these were not present, any other high-value ships, cruisers and destroyers. First wave dive bombers were to attack ground targets. Fighters were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked aircraft as possible, to ensure they did not get into the air to intercept the bombers, especially in the first wave. When the fighters' fuel got low, they were to refuel at the aircraft carriers, and return to combat. Fighters were to serve combat air patrol duties where needed, especially over U.S. airfields. Before the attack commenced, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched reconnaissance float planes from cruisers Chikuma and Tone, one to scout over Oahu and the other over Lahaina Roads, Maui, respectively, with orders to report on U.S. fleet composition and location. Citation needed. Reconnaissance aircraft flights risked alerting the U.S. and were not necessary. U.S. fleet composition and preparedness information in Pearl Harbor were already known due to the reports of the Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa. A report of the absence of the U.S. fleet, in Lahaina, anchorage off Maui, was received from the Tone's float plane and fleet submarine. Another 4 scout planes patrolled the area between the Japanese carrier force, the Kido Butai, and Niihau, to detect any counterattack. Fleet submarines embarked to type a midget submarine for transport to the waters off Oahu. The 5I boats left Pure Naval District on November 25, 1941. On December 6, they came to within 10 nautical miles or 19 kilometers. 12 miles of the mouth of Pearl Harbor, and launched their midget submarines at about 1 o'clock local time on December 7. At 3:42 Hawaiian time, the minesweeper Condor spotted a midget submarine, periscope southwest of the Pearl Harbor entrance buoy, and alerted the destroyer Ward. The midget may have entered Pearl Harbor. However, Ward sank another midget submarine at 6:37 in the first American shots in the Pacific Theater. A midget submarine on the north side of Ford Island missed the seaplane tender Curtis with her first torpedo, and missed the attacking destroyer Monahan with her other one before being sunk by Monahan at 8:43. A third midget submarine grounded twice, once outside the harbor entrance, and again on the east side of Oahu, where it was captured on December 8. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki swam ashore and was captured by Hawaii National Guard Corporal David Akui, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war. A fourth had been damaged by a depth charge attack and was abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes. It was found outside the harbor in 1960. Japanese forces received a radio message from a midget submarine at 041 on December 8, claiming damage to one or more large warships inside Pearl Harbor. The attack took place before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan, but this was not Admiral Yamamoto's intention. He originally stipulated that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were at an end. However, the attack began before the notice could be delivered. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification, commonly called the 14-part message, in 2 blocks, to the Japanese embassy in Washington. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it on schedule. In the event, it was not presented until more than an hour after the attack began. In fact, U.S. codebreakers had already deciphered and translated most of the message hours before he was scheduled to deliver it. The final part is sometimes described as a declaration of war. While it was viewed by a number of senior U.S. government and military officials as a very strong indicator negotiations were likely to be terminated, and that war might break out at any moment, it neither declared war nor severed diplomatic relations. A declaration of war was printed on the front page of Japan's newspapers in the evening edition of December 8, late December 7, in the U.S., but not delivered to the U.S. government until the day after the attack. For decades, conventional wisdom held that Japan attacked, without first formally breaking diplomatic relations, only because of accidents and bumbling that delayed the delivery of a document hinting at war to Washington. In 1999, however, Takeo Iguchi, a professor of law and international relations at International Christian University in Tokyo, discovered documents that pointed to a vigorous debate inside the government over how, and indeed whether, to notify Washington of Japan's intention to break off negotiations and start a war, including a December 7 entry in the war diary saying, "Our deceptive diplomacy is steadily proceeding toward success." Of this, Iguchi said, "The diary shows that the Army and Navy did not want to give any proper declaration of war, or indeed prior notice even of the termination of negotiations, and they clearly prevailed. In any event, even if the Japanese had decoded and delivered the 14-part message before the beginning of the attack, it would not have constituted either a formal break of diplomatic relations or a declaration of war." The final 2 paragraphs of the message. Thus the earnest hope of the Japanese government to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and promote the peace of the Pacific through cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. The first attack wave of 183 planes was launched north of Oahu, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. 6 planes failed to launch due to technical difficulties. The first attack included 3 groups of planes. The Japanese attacked in 2 waves. The first wave was detected by United States Army radar at 136 nautical miles or 252 kilometers, but was misidentified as United States Army Air Force's bombers, arriving from the American mainland. First group, targets, battleships and aircraft carriers. Second group, targets, Ford Island and Wheeler Field. Third group, targets, aircraft, at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, Kaneohe. As the first wave approached Oahu, it was detected by the U.S. Army -270 Seychelles Rupees radar at Opana Point, near the island's northern tip. This post had been in training mode for months, but was not yet operational. The operators, Privates George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Locker, reported a target to Private Joseph P. McDonald, a private stationed at Fort Shafter's Intercept Center, near Pearl Harbor. But Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, a newly assigned officer at the thinly manned Intercept Center, presumed it was the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The Japanese planes were approaching from a direction very close, only a few degrees difference, to the bombers, and while the operators had never seen a formation as large on radar, they neglected to tell Tyler of its size. Tyler, for security reasons, could not tell the operators of the 6 B-17s that were due, even though it was widely known. As the first wave of planes approached Oahu, they encountered and shot down several U.S. aircraft. At least one of these radioed a somewhat incoherent warning. Other warnings from ships off the harbor entrance were still being processed, or awaiting confirmation when the Japanese air assault began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, 3:18 a.m. December 8, Japanese Standard Time, as kept by ships of the Kido Butai, with the attack on Kaneohe. A total of 353 Japanese planes reached Oahu in 2 waves. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of surprise to attack the most important ships present, the battleships, while dive bombers attacked U.S. air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main U.S. Army Air Force's fighter base. The 171 planes, in the second wave, attacked the Army Air Force's Bellows Field, near Kaneohe, on the windward side of the island, and Ford Island. The only aerial opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SBD Dauntless dive bombers, from the carrier Enterprise. In the first wave attack, about 8 of the 49 800 kg, or 1,760 pounds, armor-piercing bombs, dropped hit their intended battleship targets. At least 2 of those bombs broke up on impact, another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and 1 was a dud. 13 of the 40 torpedoes hit battleships, and 4 torpedoes hit other ships. Men aboard U.S. ships awoke to the sounds of alarms, bombs exploding, and gunfire, prompting bleary-eyed men to dress as they ran to general quarters stations. The famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill," was sent from the headquarters of Patrol Wing 2, the 1st Senior Hawaiian Command, to respond. The defenders were very unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, in the open to prevent sabotage, guns unmanned, none of the Navy's 5.38s, only a quarter of its machine guns, and only 4 of 31 Army batteries got in action. Despite this low alert status, many American military personnel responded effectively during the attack. Ensign Joseph Tausig Jr., aboard Nevada, commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns, and was severely wounded but continued to be on post. Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas commanded Nevada in the captain's absence, and got him underway until the ship was grounded at 9:10 a.m. One of the destroyers, Aylwin, got underway with only 4 officers aboard, all ensigns, none with more than a year's sea duty. He operated at sea for 36 hours before his commanding officer managed to get back aboard. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding West Virginia, led his men until he was cut down by fragments from a bomb which hit Tennessee, moored alongside. Second wave composition. The second planned wave consisted of 171 planes, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. 4 planes failed to launch because of technical difficulties. This wave and its targets also comprised 3 groups of planes. First group, targets, aircraft, and hangars on Kaneohe, Ford Island, and Barbers Point. Second group, targets, aircraft carriers, and cruisers. Third group, targets, aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, Kaneohe. The second wave was divided into 3 groups. One was tasked to attack Kaneohe, the rest Pearl Harbor proper. The separate sections arrived at the attack point, almost simultaneously from several directions. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,008 sailors were killed and 710 others wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen, who were part of the Army prior to the independent United States Air Force in 1947, were killed and 364 wounded. 109 Marines were killed and 69 wounded, and 68 civilians were killed and 35 wounded. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,143 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. All of the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were legally non-combatants, given that there was no state of war when the attack occurred. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were due to the explosion of Arizona's forward magazine after it was hit by a modified 16-inch or 410mm shell. Author Craig Nelson wrote that the vast majority of the U.S. sailors killed at Pearl Harbor were junior enlisted personnel. The officers of the Navy all lived in houses, and the junior people were the ones on the boats, so pretty much all of the people who died in the direct line of the attack were very junior people, Nelson said. So everyone is about 17 or 18, whose story is told there. Among the notable civilian casualties were 9 Honolulu Fire Department, HFD, firefighters, who responded to Hickam Field during the bombing in Honolulu, becoming the only fire department members on American soil to be attacked by a foreign power in history. Fireman Harry Tuck Lee Pang, of Engine 6 was killed, near the hangars, by machine gun fire from a Japanese plane. Captains Thomas Macy and John Carrera, of Engine 4 and Engine 1, respectively died while battling flames inside the hangar after a Japanese bomb crashed through the roof. An additional 6 firefighters were wounded from Japanese shrapnel. The wounded later received Purple Hearts, originally reserved for service members wounded by enemy action while partaking in armed conflicts, for their peacetime actions that day on June 13, 1944. The 3 firefighters killed did not receive theirs until on December 7, 1984, at the 43rd anniversary of the attack. This made the 9 men the only non-military firefighters to receive such an award in U.S. history. Nevada, already damaged by a torpedo and on fire amidships, Nevada attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway, and sustained more hits from 250 pounds or 113 kilograms bombs, which started further fires. She was deliberately beached to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. California was hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The crew might have kept her afloat, but were ordered to abandon ship just as they were raising power for the pumps. Burning oil from Arizona and West Virginia drifted down on her and probably made the situation look worse than it was. The disarmed target ship Utah was holed twice by torpedoes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, the 7th tearing away her rudder. Oklahoma was hit by 4 torpedoes, the last 2 above her belt armor, which caused her to capsize. Maryland was hit by 2 of the converted 16-inch shells, but neither caused serious damage. Although the Japanese concentrated on battleships, the largest vessels present, they did not ignore other targets. The light cruiser Helena was torpedoed, and the concussion from the blast capsized the neighboring minelayer Oglala. 2 destroyers in dry dock, Cassin and Downs, were destroyed when bombs penetrated their fuel bunkers. The leaking fuel caught fire. Flooding the dry dock in an effort to fight fire made the burning oil rise, and both were burned out. Cassin slipped from her keel blocks and rolled against Downs. The light cruiser Raleigh was holed by a torpedo. The light cruiser Honolulu was damaged but remained in service. The repair vessel Vestal, moored alongside Arizona, was heavily damaged and beached. The seaplane tender Curtis was also damaged. The destroyer Shaw was badly damaged when 2 bombs penetrated her forward magazine. Of the 402 American aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged, 155 of them on the ground. Almost none were actually ready to take off to defend the base. 8 Army Air Forces pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with downing at least 1 Japanese aircraft during the attack. 1st Lieutenant Lewis M. Sanders, 2nd Lieutenant Philip M. Rasmussen, 2nd Lieutenant Kenneth M. Taylor, 2nd Lieutenant George S. Welch, 2nd Lieutenant Harry W. Brown, and 2nd Lieutenant Gordon H. Sterling, Jr. Of 33 PBYs in Hawaii, 30 were destroyed, and 3 on patrol, at the time of the attack returned undamaged. Friendly fire brought down some U.S. planes on top of that, including 4 from an inbound flight from Enterprise. At the time of the attack, 9 civilian aircraft were flying in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor. Of these, 3 were shot down. 55 Japanese airmen and 9 submariners were killed in the attack, and 1, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured. Of Japan's 414 available planes, 350 took part in the raid, in which 29 were lost. 9 in the first wave, 3 fighters, 1 dive bomber, and 5 torpedo bombers, and 20 in the second wave, 6 fighters and 14 dive bombers, with another 74 damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. According to some accounts, several Japanese junior officers including Fuchida and Genda urged Nagumo to carry out a 3rd strike, in order to sink more of the Pearl Harbor's remaining warships, and damage the base's maintenance shops, dry dock facilities, and oil tank yards. Most notably, Fuchida gave a first-hand account of this meeting several times after the war. However, some historians have cast doubt on this, and many other of Fuchida's later claims, which sometimes conflict with documented historic records. Genda, who opined during the planning for the attack that without an invasion 3 strikes were necessary to fully disable the Pacific Fleet, denied requesting an additional attack. Regardless, it is undisputed that the captains of the other 5 carriers in the task force reported they were willing and ready to carry out a 3rd strike soon after the second return, but Nagumo decided to withdraw for several reasons. American anti-aircraft performance had improved considerably during the second strike, and two-thirds of Japan's losses were incurred during the second wave. Nagumo felt, if he launched a third strike, he would be risking three-quarters of the combined fleet's strength to wipe out the remaining targets, which included the facilities, while suffering higher aircraft losses. The location of the American carriers remained unknown. In addition, the admiral was concerned, his force was now within range of American land-based bombers. Nagumo was uncertain whether the U.S. had enough surviving planes remaining on Hawaii to launch an attack against his carriers. A third wave would have required substantial preparation and turnaround time, and would have meant returning planes would have had to land at night. At the time, only the Royal Navy had developed night carrier techniques, so this was a substantial risk. The first two waves had launched the entirety of the combined fleet's air strength. A third wave would have required landing both the first and second wave, before launching the first wave again. Compare Nagumo's situation in the Battle of Midway, where an attack returning from Midway kept Nagumo from launching an immediate strike on American carriers. The task force's fuel situation did not permit him to remain in waters north of Pearl Harbor much longer, since he was at the very limit of logistical support. To do so risked running unacceptably low on fuel, perhaps even having to abandon destroyers en route home. He believed the second strike had essentially accomplished the mission's main objective, neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and did not wish to risk further losses. Moreover, it was Imperial Japanese Navy, practiced to prefer the conservation of strength over the total destruction of the enemy. Although a hypothetical third strike would have likely focused on the base's remaining warships, military historians have suggested any potential damage to the shore facilities would have hampered the U.S. Pacific Fleet far more seriously. If they had been wiped out, serious American operations in the Pacific would have been postponed for more than a year, according to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, later Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. It would have prolonged the war another 2 years. At a conference aboard his flagship the following morning, Yamamoto supported Nagumo's withdrawal without launching a third wave. In retrospect, sparing the vital dockyards, maintenance shops, and the oil tank farm meant the U.S. could respond relatively quickly to Japanese activities in the Pacific. Yamamoto later regretted Nagumo's decision to withdraw and categorically stated it had been a great mistake not to order a third strike. 21 American ships were damaged or lost in the attack, of which all but 3 were repaired and returned to service. After a systematic search for survivors, Captain Homer N. Wallen was ordered to lead a formal salvage operation. Around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy, shore and tenders, the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and civilian contractors, Pacific Bridge Company and others, began work on the ships that could be refloated. They patched holes, cleared debris, and pumped water out of ships. Navy divers worked inside the damaged ships. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated so they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl Harbor and on the mainland for extensive repair. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year, a total of some 20,000 man-hours underwater. Arizona, and the target ship Utah, were too heavily damaged for salvage, and remain where they were sunk, with Arizona becoming a war memorial. Oklahoma, while successfully raised, was never repaired and capsized while under tow to the mainland in 1947. The Nevada proved particularly difficult to raise and repair. 2 men involved in the operation died after inhaling poisonous gases that had accumulated in the ship's interior. When feasible, armament and equipment were removed from vessels too damaged to repair and put to use aboard other craft. The day after the attack, Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to a joint session of Congress, calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan. Congress obliged his request less than an hour later. On December 11, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, even though the Tripartite Pact did not require it. Congress issued a declaration of war against Germany and Italy later that same day. The United Kingdom had already been at war with Germany since September 1939, and with Italy since June 1940, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had promised to declare war within the hour of a Japanese attack on the United States. Upon learning of the Japanese attacks on Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, Churchill promptly determined there was no need to either wait or further consult the US government, and immediately summoned the Japanese ambassador. As a result, the UK declared war on Japan 9 hours before the US did.
Keep it up, watching my videos. To stay updated with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button. Thank you.